Hello, my name is Nathan Megstead, and like Clay said, I'm in my 5th year of school here at Dickinson State University. This December, I'll be graduating with a degree in elementary education, as well as concentrations for middle school in math and English. I'm born and raised here in Dickinson, and like he said, I'm a member of the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program. Students in the TRHLP pursue leadership development through a rigorous curriculum culminating in a leadership minor. We also learn leadership skills through involvement in service learning projects throughout our campus and community. I, along with other members of the program, will be introducing the speakers this weekend, and we are honored to have been given this privilege. So now I'd like to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Dr. Geoffrey Wawro started as a paperboy growing up in Hartford, Connecticut, and is now regarded as a world-renowned historian. He received his master's and PhD from Yale University and specializes in European history. Wawro has held the position of Professor of Strategies Studies at the U.S. Naval War College and is currently a Professor of History at the University of North Texas. He has authored 5 books, his most recent being A Mad Catastrophe, The Outbreak of World War I and the Collapse of the Habsburg Empire. Here is what Sir Michael Edward, author of War and European History, had to say about this book. This is not just a story of the part played by the Habsburg Empire in precipitating the First World War, and of the truly lamentable performance of its armies once the war began. It is a devastating indictment of a whole regime whose slovenly incompetence resulted in a military catastrophe, of which Geoff Wawro gives a truly horrifying account. Of all the histories of 1914 that are now pouring from the press, this will rank among the very best. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Geoffrey Wawro.
Thank you, Nathan, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Clay, for your very kind introduction. Clay was very good to bring me to Bismarck in 2011 for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and we had a really good time. It was, despite the subject matter, and you said it was a good, I think you said scintillating or something, but I remember he sent me a DVD of it later, and I was like, this is the most depressing talk I've ever given. I mean, that's the Middle East. You just can't have fun with the Middle East at all. And you really shouldn't be able to have fun with World War I either, because it's 100 years in the past, we can. But the Middle East, I just remember thinking, my God, it's amazing that people even stayed around for that talk. Nathan, thank you for that. That was not Michael Edward, it was Sir Michael Howard, who is a famous Oxford historian, now retired. He's in his early 90s. I visited him last summer at his house in Oxfordshire. Brilliant man. He was one of my professors at Yale. He came to Yale for a couple of years after he retired from Oxford. And he'll be the first to tell you that he was wounded twice in World War II, both time in the buttocks. He's a very modest man with not a great deal to be modest about. He's a great man. So anyway, my talk is called, according to the program, The Mad Catastrophe, An Introduction to World War I. To grasp the issues that Teddy Roosevelt grappled with during the war years, it's essential to put the Great War in its European and American contexts. The war meant entirely different things on either side of the Atlantic. In other words, Americans and Europeans had entirely different views of the war and its utility. I say utility because ultimately war, as Clausewitz famously said, is a continuation of policy by other means. And so every government, whether the Kaisers, the Tsars, or the American presidents, had to view World War I either as an opportunity or a dead end. The respective view of the participants shaped their responses and their level of effort. Now, for the Europeans, the Mad Catastrophe of 1914 had very long roots. Great war scholars have spent 100 years debating the origins, but the consensus is this. The war exploded in 1914 for a whole range of reasons. First, there was continual diplomatic tension between the alliance blocs, the British, French, Russian Triple Entente, and the Austro-Italian-German Triple Alliance. This tension had nearly exploded into war in 1905 during the First Moroccan Crisis, in 1911 during the Second Moroccan Crisis, and during the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913. Then there was the tension of the arms races and war plans. All of the powers were arming themselves in the decades after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, integrating the new technologies of war, like quick-firing artillery, machine guns, high-explosive shells, magazine rifles, strategic railways, and dreadnought battleships. The German Army Law of 1912, for example, vastly expanded the German army at the same time that the Germans were engaged in a navy race with England, racing to outbuild the Royal Navy in the critical new technology of dreadnoughts. This German aggressiveness called forth the Russian Great Army Program and the French Three-Year Law of 1913, raising the stakes across the board. This growing influence of general and naval staffs and what we today call the military-industrial complex was called militarism by contemporaries. Well, there was no question that militarism was risky. There was a sense in Europe and America that military decision-makers were acquiring far-ranging and dangerous new powers. The German Schlieffen Plan, worked up between 1900 and 1905, was an open secret. It aimed to invade France through Belgium with 2 million troops. This, in its turn, provoked the French Plan 17 of 1912, which aimed to mass 80% of the French army, 700,000 to 800,000 troops, on the borders of Alsace-Lorraine for a lightning strike into Germany. To ensure that France wasn't annihilated by the Schlieffen Plan, the Russians worked up their own Plan 20, which prepared a rapid invasion of Germany and Austria-Hungary with 1.4 million troops. The Austrian plan was designed to invade Serbia or Russia promptly as circumstances dictated. Traditionally wedded to splendid isolationism, even the British had to get serious, beefing up the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, to a strength of 300,000 men for rapid deployment to France or Belgium in the event of war. Europe, in other words, had placed itself on a hair trigger by 1914. A real crisis tending toward war would almost certainly trigger an avalanche effect. Imperialism was another cause of the war, as each of the great powers sought to secure its place in the sun, overseas colonies, to have new markets, coaling stations for the navies, resource areas, and manpower. The powers annexed 90% of Africa between 1878 and 1900, and much of the rest of the world too. They tended to view this as a zero-sum game. If one country got something, it meant nothing for the others. And so the imperialism was a powerful goad to war. The mood of 1914 itself, the zeitgeist, if you will, was another cause of the war. Each of the European powers was in the midst of a social and political crisis in 1914. Since the 1870s, Europe had become more urban, more populous, more industrialized, and better educated. The populations of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia had doubled between 1870 and 1914. Europe, like America, was living in an age of masses, characterized by big, vibrant cities, but also crime, slums, and poverty. Mass politics were the result. New nationalist or religious or class parties and radical, liberal, socialist, communist, or anarchist parties on the left. As peasants migrated to the cities, a dangerous new underclass formed. Its anger and violence showed in the string of anarchist assassinations. Tsar Alexander II killed in 1881, President James Garfield killed the same year, Austrian Empress Elizabeth killed in 1898, the Italian King Umberto killed in 1901, and then, of course, President William McKinley also killed in 1901, uncorking TR's presidential career. The growth of left-wing parties exerted pressure on Europe's conservative elites. In 1905, there was an attempted revolution in Russia. In 1912, the German socialists became the biggest party in the Kaiser's Reichstag. Labor in Britain had already emerged as a powerful rival to the Tory and liberal establishment. Italy had become virtually ungovernable by 1914. So powerful and restive were the labor unions there. Austria-Hungary by 1914 was totally unworkable. Indeed, the Reichsrat in Vienna had to be closed because of the continuous quarrels between the parties and the nationalities. And the vaunted Hungarian parliament in Budapest enfranchised just 7% of Hungarians and ruthlessly oppressed the non-Magyar minorities. By 1914, most European governments had come to view a great war as a good means to purge the system and use wartime emergency powers like martial law to crush the left in a fever of what the Germans called hurrah patriotismus, hurrah patriotism. As one German general put it, let's have a brisk, merry little war to clean out the Reichstag once and for all. Well, all that was needed to set this tinder ablaze was another crisis, one that would engage the vital interests of the two alliance blocs. When the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo in June 1914, he became the casus belli, not because his assassination merited a great war, but because the powers wanted war. The Germans actually pushed the Austrians into the war, and so desperate were the Austrians to save their crumbling empire that they allowed themselves to be pushed. The Russians, eager to showcase their new model army and to make huge annexations in Poland, Ukraine, and the Balkans, did nothing to slow the descent into war during the July crisis of 1914. Indeed, the Russians escalated the war by mobilizing on July 29th. And so war came. Although the professional militaries had predicted a fast Franco-Prussian war type campaign, the war they got was anything but. And how could it have been otherwise? You had the Triple Entente with 260 million people and 5.4 million troops, ranged against the Central Powers with their 120 million people and 3.5 million troops. Both of these coalitions had armed themselves to the teeth in the years before the war. Predictably, to us, not to them, the 1914 campaigns shattered against defensive fire. The casualties on all fronts were monstrous. The French lost 300,000 men in the opening Battle of the Frontiers. The Germans lost 250,000 men at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The Russians lost 300,000 men at the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914. The Austrians lost 1/3 of their army in the first month of combat in Galicia. 420,000 men there, and then they lost another 250,000 in Serbia. And so it went, depressingly, in 1915, 1916, and even 1917. The hoped-for war of movement became a static war of exhaustion. In 1915, France lost an additional 550,000 men, fruitlessly attacking the ground the Germans had conquered in 1914. From March to December 1915, the Allies shifted strategy with the Gallipoli campaign. 17 British and French divisions were landed in the Turkish Straits, the Dardanelles, the straits connecting the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, to knock out the Turks and then roll up the Central Powers from the flank. This attempt to use the mobility of the Royal Navy to hit them where they ain't proved a bloody fiasco. The Allies losing another 250,000 men to no apparent effect. Italy, which had begun the war as an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary and then switched sides, it entered the war on the side of the Allies in May 1915 and was expected to bash in the southern flank of the Austrian Empire with Italy's 1,000,000 troops. In 4 bloody battles of the Isonzo in 1915, the Italians lost 300,000 men and didn't even move the lines an inch. Britain's commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, planned a war-ending blow for 1916. The British had spent 2 entire years converting their small professional army of 7 divisions, the BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, into a mass army of eventually 70 divisions. The first test of this new army would be the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes were high. The British rained a preliminary barrage of unprecedented intensity, 1.5 million shells on the German trenches. All in vain. In 5 months of combat, the British never broke through, and they lost 620,000 casualties. The Germans, 450,000. Notoriously, the British lost 60,000 killed and wounded on the first day of the Somme offensive. The German General Staff Chief, Helmut von Moltke, had been replaced by General Erich von Falkenhayn in late 1914 after the failure on the Marne. Falkenhayn planned to use defensive fortifications, the trenched line in the west, to bleed the French and British white and force them to concede defeat. Until 1916, Falkenhayn looked to be succeeding, as the British and French failure to break through at the Somme suggested. Falkenhayn was the war's first modern strategist. Falkenhayn realized the futility of breakthrough operations such as those pondered by all of his predecessors on both sides. And Falkenhayn instead looked to attrition. Time was short. The British blockade of the Central Powers in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean was causing hunger on the home front and throttling Germany's critical war industries. Falkenhayn planned Operation Gericht, better known as the Battle of Verdun, which became a 10-month slog dedicated not to conquering ground, but simply to killing Frenchmen. The French initially fell into the trap, but guided by General Philippe Pétain, they stopped attacking the Germans and forced the Germans to attack them. So, after 10 months, 1,000,000 men were killed or wounded in that single iconic battle, and yet nothing significant was achieved by either side. The lines at Verdun hardly moved. The Allies countered this German attrition strategy by tightening the naval blockade, hoping to strangle the German and Austrian economies and peoples by shutting off all imports of food and raw materials. The Germans, viewing the blockade as a crime against humanity, it was literally starving German women and children, began their second campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. By April 1917, the Germans were sinking 900,000 tons of British-bound shipping a month, reducing the British bread supply to just a few weeks. In this horrifying attritional war, the intervention of neutrals became critical. Italy was the first prize to fall to the Entente in 1915, but America was the greatest prize of all. America was the decisive weight in the World War. America's potential was stunning. A population of 100 million people, 10 million men of military age, a fleet of 3 million tons, factories, shipyards, arsenals, forests, and farms with thousands of workers. Whoever got America was going to win the World War. This was especially apparent after the disasters of 1917. In April 1917, the same month that the U.S. declared war on Germany, the French attacked the Chemin des Dames behind an unprecedented barrage of 11 million shells, 8 times the barrage at the Battle of the Somme a year earlier. The attack, hailed as a war winner, turned into a bloody fiasco. 120,000 French troops were chewed up, and the French army mutinied after it, not going over to the offensive again until 1918. To rescue the situation, Haig launched the Passchendaele Offensive in July 1917, which ranks, along with Verdun, as one of the iconic failures of a war filled with them. Despite a preliminary barrage of 12 million shells, or probably because of the preliminary barrage, Passchendaele was in Flanders, which has a high water table, so dropping 12 million shells into this area, that's where they have dikes, the Dutch and the Belgians have dikes to keep back the North Sea, was to create an inundation, which basically made the no man's land impassable. So the more British troops drowned trying to cross no man's land and falling into shell holes than were actually killed by German fire. But despite this barrage of 12 million shells, the British made limited progress and lost another 400,000 men. By 1917, both France and Britain were gripped by manpower crises. They were literally running out of soldiers. On the Eastern Front, Russia's last gasp, the Kerensky Offensive, failed in July 1917, and Russia fell out of the war altogether as Lenin launched the Bolshevik Revolution in November. In October 1917, the Italians, having lost 1 million men since 1915 for a net gain of 18 miles, the Italians were effectively knocked out of the war at the Battle of Caporetto. There on the Isonzo River, today's border between Italy and Slovenia, Italy lost 350,000 troops to a coordinated Austro-German offensive. The Italian army literally dissolved, losing the equivalent of 36 divisions in its shambolic retreat to the Piave, which is beautifully described, of course, by Ernest Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms. Plainly, American intervention was critical to the outcome of the war, particularly as the Germans were planning to combine the forces that they could pull out of Russia with everything they had on the Western Front to launch what they hoped would be a war-winning offensive with 80 divisions in 1918. But what did America want? Well, the short answer, America didn't know what it wanted. In the first place, America, right down to the moment of intervention in 1917 and the first deployments in 1918, was utterly unprepared for war. And this wasn't an accident. America was unprepared because it didn't want to prepare. Much is made of Teddy Roosevelt's contempt for Woodrow Wilson's hesitation in World War I. TR was for speedy, decisive intervention on the side of the Entente. But really, Wilson suffered from the need actually to govern, whereas TR could postulate the wildest things from the sidelines without having to describe how they could actually be achieved. In January 1916, while the war lengthened in Europe, the 10-month Battle of Verdun was about to begin, and America's Lusitania affair with Germany dragged on. Wilson, in January 1916, left the White House and embarked on a Western trip to push for rearmament. Wilson had notoriously and rather unfortunately said after the Lusitania sinking in 1915 that there is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. But Wilson's hesitation probably had more to do with American unpreparedness than moral qualms. The American West, places like Dickinson, where we're sitting right now, was where resistance to intervention was strongest. At a stop in Cleveland, Wilson said this, "I'm troubled by our military weakness. I'm really troubled. I fear the danger of not being able to express the real character of this great nation with a big force. I have no idea what tomorrow will bring. We are daily surrounded by dangers. We must hold the honor of the nation dearer than peace." Wilson, in other words, differed not at all with Teddy Roosevelt on the question of military strength. What mattered in the critical midterm years of the Great War was that no amount of presidential huffing and puffing was going to persuade an isolationist Congress and a hostile public to intervene in World War I or even pay for a stronger military. Wilson famously ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan that he had kept us out of the war, and he won re-election on that platform. When asked in January 1916 whether America should join the Entente, Harvard University President Charles Eliot, certainly representative of the American intelligentsia, answered oddly to our ears today, but entirely in keeping with his times. Eliot said this, "I favor a naval alliance with Britain and France for world peace, but no radical changes in our military establishment. No, for the Army, I recommend a Swiss system. In this way, the United States could maintain an army copied from the Swiss without the least danger of creating a military class such as that which exists in every European nation." In other words, despite the menace of the war, American opinion still militated against a big standing army and the temptation that such a big standing army might present to political involvement and foreign adventures. Wilson, a true Democrat, shared this view. Well, this cleavage cut very deep in American society and politics. Between 1865 and 1917, the Republican Party was a predominantly Eastern power backed by industry, finance, and the great trusts. It tended to be expansionist and imperialist, and it had held the White House virtually without interruption since Abraham Lincoln. In the years after the Civil War, however, the Democrats began broadening their base from the South to the new states of the West. The Democrats were pledged to combat centralization from Washington insiders, stop wars of expansion like the Spanish-American War and certainly World War I, break up trusts and monopolies, and reform the tariff. The Democratic presidential candidate every 4 years from 1896 to 1912 was William Jennings Bryan, who rejected all wars of adventure and focused on righting the wrongs of American society. Wilson's victory in 1912 was unexpected and earth-shaking and owed entirely to the rift in the Republican Party created by Teddy Roosevelt's progressives. A Democrat had finally broken the Republican lock on the White House. Among his first acts was to make Bryan, the great commoner, the peerless one, his Secretary of State. Now, how could a Democrat take the country to war, and to this war in particular? A war that had been caused by overlapping European imperialisms, a war that seemed greedy, stupid, endless, and cataclysmic. Teddy Roosevelt liked to speak of Britain as a fellow democracy, but to Democrats, it looked like a typical European imperialist power, which, of course, it was. Although willing to intervene in the Western Hemisphere to enforce the Monroe Doctrine and to enforce an open door in East Asia, the United States had refused to make any alliances or even ententes with European powers. The French called this America's traditional politique d'isolement, policy of isolation, and it dated from Monroe. The 1914 declarations of war in Europe shook the U.S. Even Americans knowledgeable about foreign affairs could not immediately make sense of the situation, of how a relatively typical European crisis, remember there had been crises like this in 1905, 1908, 1911, 1912, and 1913, and they hadn't flared into a general war. How had this relatively typical crisis escalated so quickly into an all-out world war? Teddy Roosevelt, for example, took 2 entire months to formulate a position on the European war. And when he did, in an article in Outlook, he recommended neutrality and warned Americans not to vilify Germany. A general ignorance of European affairs made most Americans accept Wilson's neutrality policy without debate. This gradually changed. The U.S. public was shocked by German brutality in Belgium and shocked by the Lusitania affair, but opinion in America remained solidly isolationist. Secretary of State Bryan was rigorously neutral, not least because he sympathized with the German view that the U.S. never behaved like a true neutral in the war. The U.S. permitted the Royal Navy to keep America's merchant fleet out of German waters, and thus tacitly sided with the Entente. Without imports of food, German civilians starved, and Bryan saw this as morally loathsome. Why be shocked at the drowning of a few people if there is to be no objection to the starving of an entire nation, was Bryan's analysis of the Lusitania affair. What really changed the U.S. attitude were the economic and financial pressures of the war. As the Entente powers pledged gold and stocks as collateral for American loans, the surge in assets sparked inflation in America, which was already suffering a recession when the war broke out. Then came the crisis of raw materials. As the Allies ordered massive quantities of steel, ammunition, copper, and other items, prices on these commodities surged, fueling yet more inflation, but also crowding out American needs. Nothing was left for the internal development of the United States. No rails, girders, machinery, oil, or copper for power lines. European purchases also slammed America's transportation sector, as the price of rail and ship transport went through the roof. Simply put, Americans couldn't get their goods to market during World War I. Though the big industrial sectors did well out of the war, the broader American economy suffered from a business slowdown, from inflated prices, and from lowered living standards. Workers suffered too. The surge in immigration before the war meant that firms could pay lower wages despite the surge in demand. Farmers in America left the land to work in the factories. Wheat production was halved between 1914 and 1916. The price of wheat in America rose 14-fold in those 2 years. What this meant was that the broader U.S. was actually suffering from wartime prosperity, all, as people felt and said at the time, for the profit of a handful of Eastern bankers and industrialists. By 1916, it was clear in America that the European war was a disaster for the United States of America. It had to end quickly to return the American economy to normal, but also to save European markets, which would be critical for future U.S. exports, and they were on the road to ruin because of the war. In late 1916, the U.S. actually considered an embargo on munitions exports. The cost of salaries and raw materials was by then so high that they weren't even particularly profitable. the Fed counseled against more loans to the Entente, knowing full well that this would stop the export of munitions and other war material. This was also the occasion for Woodrow Wilson's first note, which suggested that America wanted peace and would impose peace on Europe by peaceful means or by war if necessary. Well, the key point here is that Wilson and his new Secretary of State, Lansing, were pushing for war not from sympathy with the Allies. There could be no American alliance with Tsarist Russia, especially with so many first-generation Jewish, Russian, and Polish immigrants in America who detested the Russian Empire. And Americans in general were anti-British. Britain, after all, was America's hereditary enemy. I mean, it had been fought against us in the Revolution, the War of 1812, and quite recently in the American Civil War, supporting the South against the North. And there was much suspicion of Italy and its threats to Greece and to Dalmatia. In sum, what sympathy there was in America for the Allies by 1916 was constrained by the fact that Americans recognized that the Allies did not sincerely accept democratic principles or the right of national self-determination. With all of the Entente powers planning to make big annexations after the war, all over the world, former German colonies, partitioning the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, Americans, as late as 1917, tended to view the Great War, not without reason, as simply a war of opposing imperialisms and certainly not a crusade for liberty or democracy. Then there was the question of the Americans themselves. In 1914, there were 20 million German Americans, 1/5 of the U.S. population. This was a staggeringly large voting bloc. 40% of cities like Cleveland, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and Hoboken were German. This was not a bloc to be antagonized by any politician interested in re-election. Teddy Roosevelt famously dubbed those German Americans, along with anti-British Irish Americans, as the foes of our own household, the Huns within our gates. Press barons like Hearst were openly pro-German and used their newspapers to push a pro-German line, like peace based on the status quo antebellum, i.e. no return of Alsace-Lorraine from the Germans to the French, arguing for slowing the shipment of goods and munitions to the Allies, arguing for slowing the decision on an expansion of the U.S. Army and the dispatch of troops to Europe. Hearst, in his newspapers, proposed England and Japan as far more logical enemies of America than Germany. World War I posed complex questions for politicians in Washington. Even when Germany definitively crossed the line in 1917 with resumed submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram inciting war with Mexico, the U.S. government had to take care not to antagonize the Germans too much. Even if America intervened, the U.S. would do so in part to manage the war and manage the fate of Germany, so that Berlin would not be humiliated and impoverished after the war. That would lead to political problems with this massive German-American voting bloc. By 1916, the Germans had come to regard the U.S. as a hostile belligerent in all but name. German accusations against America as a crypto-belligerent fell into three main categories. Number one, the U.S. was supplying 25% of the guns and ammo used by the Allies in the war. The Germans believed that without these supplies, the war couldn't go on. Hence, the Germans blamed America for prolonging the war. Number two, the U.S. was furnishing the Allies with the liquidity to wage war, a total of $12 billion by 1916. And just put that into Google. What's $12 billion in 1916 in 2014 dollars? I'm sure it is a hell of a lot of money. The Germans believed that without these funds, the Allies simply couldn't have gone on as long as they did, which they certainly couldn't. Number three, the U.S. blocked every effort by Germany to pursue unrestricted submarine warfare, which was Germany's only weapon against the suffocating British blockade. But beyond these measures, supplies, loans, and diplomatic pressure, what could America actually do to make its tremendous power felt? American military preparedness in 1914, and indeed even in 1917, was nothing short of pathetic. The nation had long considered itself safe behind its ocean barriers in East and West. The country was willing to spend on a powerful navy, but the army was minuscule. It having been the policy of the United States since its founding not to maintain a large, standing, regular army. Teddy Roosevelt published a piece in the New York Times in September 1914 that complained of this fact. Our army, he wrote, is as small as Persia's, our navy third in the world. When Congress had reluctantly voted to expand the number of regulars in the U.S. Army to 100,000 in 1901, President McKinley had fixed the number of effectives at 75,000, well below the congressional level. As McKinley put it, I wanted to appease opponents who view a big military as a tool to carry out imperialist policy. The Army Inspector General that year wrote the Secretary of War, "We may never hope for a permanent army strong enough to bear unaided even the first shock of any power invading American borders, much less to fight a war to a successful conclusion or to invade the territory of any other power." Well, that was essentially the situation in 1914. The U.S. Army was still tiny, just 150,000 troops in 30 regiments, 17 cavalry regiments, and 9 field artillery regiments. Most U.S. artillery was coastal artillery, which meant it was heavy and immobile, and it was stuck guarding the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, as well as Panama, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And World War I was a war of artillery. Artillery emerged as the queen of the battlefield very early in the war. So without any field artillery, the U.S. was not going to make any gains whatsoever. The American Army had no effective reserve because a new Army law creating 230,000 reserves, a drop in the bucket anyway, wouldn't take full effect till 1920. So the only reserve was America's National Guard, which totaled 112,000 in all of the states, but was anything but a fearsome weapon. During the conflict with Mexico in 1914, the U.S. could only send 17,000 troops to the border. No others could be spared. The National Guard units sent were useless. They came mainly from Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. It was a galling, humiliating moment for a great power. The events in Mexico, the French embassy wrote in 1914, catch the U.S. in flagrante delicto of military unpreparedness. Only in 1917, under the pressure of intervention, did the U.S. suddenly begin to build a 1,000,000-man army of 50 divisions. But there were only 6,000 officers in the 1914 army. So tens of thousands of novices had to be hastily trained at the last minute. Yet even their regular officer instructors, the ones who had been serving in the army for years, they had no experience of modern war. They'd been on garrison duty around the United States and in Hawaii and the Philippines. And there was a total lack of NCOs. NCOs also had to be trained from scratch by people who had no military experience. In those officer training camps in 1917, there was no practical instruction, no serious trench work, no use of grenades, mortars, or machine guns. Artillery officer candidates like Harry Truman never fired a field gun or even saw one being fired. Consider this. It had taken Great Britain 2 entire years to transform from the small colonial army that had been wiped out at the Battle of Mons in 1914 to the new mass army of 1916, 2 entire years. Well, the U.S. was going to need at least as much time. That's one reason the Germans gambled everything on the great Ludendorff offensive of 1918. They planned to knock the British and French out before the U.S. could intervene effectively. In view of all this, the horrors of World War I, the vast German-American population, the ignorance of the heartland as to the main issues of the war, and the military unpreparedness of America, the intervention question stressed by Theodore Roosevelt was just not as compelling a question as you might suppose at first blush. Roosevelt deplored Wilson's supine inaction, as he put it, but Wilson was constrained by the American public and its elected representatives. Wilson, in 1915, still described World War I as a war with which we have nothing to do. In other words, the 28th president detected the terrible cant inhered in the war, the claim by avowedly imperialist powers, Britain, France, and Italy, to represent democracy and liberty against other imperialist powers. For this reason, Woodrow Wilson insisted in 1917-1918 on a separate American army merely associated with the Entente, and he and Pershing planned to win the war in 1919 or even 1920 with American men and materiel, and they planned to dominate the peace talks afterward. They were both surprised, as was everyone, by the suddenness of the end in 1918. This gave Britain and France a much stronger hand at the Paris Peace Conference than they would have had the war dragged on into 1920, as Wilson and Pershing expected. Entering the war reluctantly, Wilson considered the game worth the candle only if America could shape a new world order afterward. Wilson had no interest in plucking British, French, and Italian chestnuts out of the fire if the only result was going to be an expansion of their fleets and empires across the globe after the war. Well, in this view, most Americans concurred. Certainly after the war, when the disillusion of the failed peace process set in, they concurred even more, retreating into an even deeper isolation. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, that wasn't depressing at all. Oh my goodness, you've set the table beautifully for the next couple of days. I know the audience has questions, and you've given us a lot to think about with respect to TR. I know people have questions, so raise your hand when you'd like to ask a question. Let me start with the easy one, and that's your characterization of TR. So, from the beginning, TR believed that we would inevitably be drawn into this war, that any thought that we were going to be able to escape it was not good strategic thinking, and that we had better be prepared for that moment when it came. And preparedness is not such a bad thing anyway, because we would want to try to dominate the post-war environment, and we would need to have some oomph to be able to do that. And it would seem that circumstances vindicated him, that he saw prophetically that the United States could not in the end escape the war, and that if we weren't prepared, it was going to not only prolong the casualties of the European catastrophe, but that it might make us less effective as a broker when the war was concluded. So I know you said he was sort of bloviating from the sidelines and didn't have the burden of power, but wasn't he in fact spot on?
Well, I mean, I would say that, Teddy Roosevelt, there were a lot of issues with Teddy Roosevelt. You know, he was a social Darwinist, which meant he believed in the sort of cleansing value of war, that it strengthened the society's character and muscles, and I think that view is nonsensical, and it was very current at the time, and TR was by no means unusual in that view. but the view that dragged us into World War I in the first place. All these European societies were affected by this social Darwinist feeling that war was a good thing. You know, it toughened people up and it toughened up societies, and that warlike societies succeeded and peaceful societies, you know, were condemned to sort of ruin and decrepitude. And that view was fatuous, you know, ultimately, and it was disastrous and tragic. And so, no, I don't. I love Theodore Roosevelt. I think he was a great president. I love everything he stands for. I think he was the best Republican, since Lincoln. But I think that he was wrong on World War I, and I think that he was. I think it's a lot like regarding what's going on in the Middle East today. Most Americans are very uneasy about it. Most Americans don't want to be involved. Most Americans don't want boots on the ground. And I think that was the view, I know that was the view of Americans in World War I. They were like, this is not our fight. And they were sickened by the continual European crises over matters of prestige and colonies. And they were like, why on earth do we want to put American wealth, lives, and power at stake in this European game? And they stuck very firmly to the Monroe Doctrine and the open door in East Asia, and the Europeans could go tear themselves to pieces as far as Americans were concerned. And I think this was the view of most people. And I think Roosevelt is a real outlier in this, again, because of his physicality, social Darwinism, his Anglophilia. But as I say in my talk, America was an anti-English country. We hated the British. I mean, they were the people that had tried to keep us down, and then they tried to take us back in 1812, and they'd supported the South against the Union in the Civil War, and they'd supported the French colony in Mexico, in the 1860s after the Civil War. So there was no affection for Great Britain, and there was a sense that Britain was a far more dangerous rival than Germany. So my point is, although ultimately Roosevelt's position that we need to take a position in this war is sustained. I think if you are realistic and you look at events as they played out, it's a little bit like today, someone like Lindsey Graham or John McCain saying, we need to do more in the Middle East. Well, okay. And maybe 100 years from now we'll say, those guys were right. But right now nobody agrees with them, right? And they look like real outliers. So I think Wilson really represented the view of the American public, the view of the Congress, and was very uneasy about involvement in the war. And when the United States ultimately did get involved, I think it was very interesting, Wilson's position on the war. It was not to join up with the Entente, to win the war with the Entente. Wilson's position was like, I really don't want anything to do with these people. They are utterly corrupt. They're planning to take over the German colonies, partition the Ottoman Empire, take the oil resources of the Middle East. So I am going to be an associated power, and I'm going to build up to such a massive strength that the United States will win this war. And then we will dictate the terms of peace, which will be a new world order, which will be true national self-determination. We are not going to facilitate the expansion of the British, French, and Italian empires. And again, it was a huge surprise that Germany collapsed in 1918. Remember, the German army was not defeated. They were solidly entrenched in the Hindenburg Line. The only reason that Germany collapsed in November 1918 was because of revolution inside Germany, which nobody predicted. And it was because of the British blockade, the starvation, the hunger, all the privations. And so finally, the Navy mutinied, and then it spread into the cities, and the army had to basically go back into Germany and concede an armistice. But the war should have gone on into 1919 or 1920. And at that point, the U.S. was planning to be up to a strength of 4 or 5 million troops. The U.S. was going to win the war almost single-handedly. And then Wilson and Pershing were going to dictate the terms of the peace. And it would have been a very different peace than the Treaty of Versailles.
Well, I'm tempted to ask the question again, but I'm not going to because you'd give an equally long answer. But if Roosevelt had lived to 1920, he would have said, you can call me fatuous, and you can say I'm a social Darwinist, and you can say that I'm a warmonger and a jingo, but I turned out to have been right, and if you'd listened to me, this would have come out better.
No, but here's the thing. I mean, Roosevelt would have committed American power prematurely to the side of the Entente, and helped the Entente defeat the Germans and essentially created more powerful rivals to the United States. I mean, think about it after World War II. What is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's greatest concern? Is that in the post-war order, with the Cold War looming, he doesn't want to strengthen the British and French empires because he sees this is going to antagonize all the peoples of the Third World and turn them into communists. So his whole thing is, look, we need to create these sort of modern states and detach these places from the British and French or Italian empires. And you know, with U.S. patronage, they can develop. That was the story of South Vietnam, or you name it. And so Wilson was dealing with the same thing. He was like, it's not in America's interest to strengthen the British or French empires.
Questions for our distinguished keynote? Yeah, starting here. Speak up. Yeah, let's take that question. Were there people who were speaking, celebrities or people of great national prominence speaking out against the war as we moved into it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there was, I can't name any celebrities of the time, but there was no broad support for intervention. America wanted to remain out of this war because it literally struck Americans as being entirely alien and being entirely a product of European dissension and something that America shouldn't be involved in whatsoever because of the, I cited the casualties, 250,000 here, 500,000 there. It was a meat grinder, and we're like, why would we want to get involved? And then, of course, when we did get involved, American casualties were relatively small, 100,000, which is a lot, obviously, but small compared to the European losses. But even that was a cause of tremendous disillusion after the war. Why did we lose 100,000 guys for what?
Other questions? We'll come back to you. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, the legacy of the war with respect to the reshaping of Europe and the Near East and the Ukraine in particular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the war was the legacy for Ukraine and East Central Europe in general was, Wilson's big idea was the 14 points and national self-determination, and yet national self-determination was applied to everyone except for Germans, and the Germans were prevented from gathering in the German populations of Eastern Europe. Gathering in the Austrian Republic was forbidden by law to join with the Weimar Republic. And then, of course, 3 million Germans in Czechoslovakia, 1.5 million Germans in Poland, 800,000 Germans in Romania, all forcibly detached from the Reich or from the Weimar Republic and forced to live in these faraway places. So this was another, the way that you should, if you haven't read Harold Nicholson's book, Peacemaking 1919, it's Nicholson's memoir. He was there. It's short. It's a brilliant read. It's this anecdotal account of what it was like to be at the Paris Peace Conference. And people were falling asleep at meetings and drooling on their notes, and they couldn't keep up with what percentage of the population, so they just were like, yeah, whatever, and voting, and then you'd have like 1 million Germans stuck inside Poland, or you'd have 1 million Hungarians stuck inside Romania, and then of course this would lead to war later. So the whole thing was done in sort of this this all-nighter kind of haste, and created tremendous problems. And as for Ukraine, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Russian Empire, and it was sort of a great prize after the Russian Revolution. All the Western powers wanted to detach it from the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviets wanted it, so it became this big field in the Russian Civil War between whites and reds, and so it was fought over as viciously as it's being fought over today, right? And but that the whole. This is one of the interesting, what might have beens of the whole thing is if Wilson and Pershing had been right and the war had gone on into 1919 and the U.S. had built up this indomitable strength, which we were on the way. I mean, our first interventions in the war were terrible. I mean, embarrassingly. The historiography on Saint Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne below Wood is very incomplete. I mean, we know these as being American feats of arms, but There was a lot of blundering too, but we were really getting it with the combat experience. We would have been a really formidable force by 19, and we would have dominated everything. And then Wilson would have had the power to really dictate the peace in Europe and really might have removed some of these problems. But the problem, of course, was Wilson himself, his health, his stroke, and then, so he became incapacitated. And plus, there were problems with Wilson as a politician. He just didn't work well with Republicans. He didn't work well across the aisle. He didn't work well with anybody. He was just really your typical professor, talking way too much, right?
Okay. That's great. Yes, sir. Right. Go ahead. After World War II, we dominated world affairs.
Well,
after World War I, was there a similar effort?
I mean, that was my point, was that's what they were
heading towards.
Had the war lasted longer. The crisis of effectives in the French army the French were literally down to like no men. And the British had a lot of men only because they were running the war industries that were keeping everybody going. But even they were running out of men. So the plan was to intervene along those lines, but then what happened with the war ending abruptly and the Paris Peace Conference being such a shambles and looking like it was being hijacked by these quasi-imperialist powers, Britain and France, helping themselves to the U.S. Congress was like, screw this, we don't want to be involved in this. And they also didn't like the whole League of Nations and the fact of maybe a collective armed force to enforce peace. And this is where Wilson really failed. I mean, he could have really worked the aisles and arranged some kind of a compromise with Republicans in Congress that would have kept the U.S. involved. But the point is, had the war gone on, had the U.S. had the whip hand in 1919, 1920, then a lot of these problems would have been solved just by the fact that we would have been this sort of overawing power with so much power to basically dispose of Europe. But we didn't. We arrived at this position where we were just one of 3 or 4 powers. And this was, but the plan was to become involved in that way. But not in the same way of financing in the way of the Marshall Plan. More like just setting up a just and equitable peace.
Other questions? Yes, back here. I think you all heard that, but let me go back to what you said in your lecture, that Roosevelt wrestled with this for a couple of months before he finally determined what his policy was. And I know that early on, Roosevelt gave an analysis quite like the beginning of your lecture, that this is not, that there are different reasons from different powers to do this. There are lots of dynamics that are at play here. There's no real righteous power. It's really a European conflict that has been coming for a long time. So a somewhat rational and dispassionate analysis, but then he decided that the rape of Belgium was a crime against humanity, and it forced our hand to moralize the war and get involved.
Well, I mean, yes, it's true that the atrocities in Belgium, which it's for a while, initially people believed in them, and then they were sort of poo-pooed, like, oh, that didn't really happen, or it was Allied propaganda. But there's been more recent scholarship. There's a book called Rehearsals about this, that a guy who went in to Belgian archives and discovered incredible evidence. I mean, so they were as bad as they were made out to be. And that was a big factor, as was the sinking of the Lusitania. But again, who's an American in this period? I mean, Americans are people like my grandfather, who came from Austria-Hungary, and he arrived in 1912, and he had served in the Austro-Hungarian. He's like, thank God I'm out of that place. What do you think he would have thought about going back to fight in European quarrels in an American uniform? I mean, he was like, I came to America to escape that nonsense, and now you want to send me back there to mediate that nonsense? So there was, and America was, think about the explosion of immigration that happened at the turn of the century, from, chiefly from, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Italy, and these people were clustered in critical states with electoral votes, and so they were an important voting bloc, and none of them had any appetite for war. And that was the situation. So whether you talk about the rape of Belgium, the sinking of Lusitania, horrible things indeed, but most Americans, most average Americans didn't care. The people that wanted to intervene in this war tended to be elites, intelligentsia or Republican Party establishment figures from, finance, industry, who had, economic irons in the fire. Your average American, certainly out here in North Dakota, had zero interest in getting involved in this war.
We'll hear more about that from Kim Porter. Let me ask a quick follow-up question about that, Jeff. I know this is counterfactual, but two questions. One is, what would have happened, do you think, if the United States had just decided we're not going to get involved? If we had just left this to Europe and absorbed the blows that came to the Lusitania and other shipping? And secondly, if Roosevelt had not been Roosevelt, if he had been a deferential former president instead of a loudmouth former president and a very famous and powerful former president, how would that have changed the internal dynamics, do you think?
Well, I mean, the U.S. was going to get involved because of the unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram. I mean, the Zimmerman telegram I think is fascinating.
Explain
because
that to me.
It was the discovery in 1917 when the Austrian consul general in New York left his briefcase on the subway, and inside was this plan by the and it came out through other sources as well. But and his name, by the way, was Dumba, D-U-M-B-A, which I always thought was a perfect name for an Austrian consul general leaving his briefcase on the subway with secret war plans inside. It was to get the Mexicans to invade the southwestern United States and take back Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, while the U.S. was going off to war in Europe. And I always thought, well, that's going to really happen. But the fact is, with the U.S. being so militarily weak, an army of 150,000, the Mexican army was bigger than the U.S. army in 1914. So that could have happened, right? So it was a serious threat. And so you put the Zimmerman telegram together with the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and we were going to get involved for moral reasons, but also for great power, political reasons. There was a sense that the U.S. really had to start punching in its actual weight class and stop punching at the level of a Honduras or a Persia. So that was going to happen, and eventually. So I think it's not valid to say, what if the U.S. has stayed out? A historian like Neil Ferguson, in his book The Pity of War, says, well, look, what would have happened if the Germans had won World War I? It would have just been like the EU happening, 80 years earlier, right? It would have been like this great European Union, which I think is insincere, because the German plans for Europe were horrific. I mean, they already were colonizing the East, expelling Slavs and Jews, moving in Germans. They were planning on making massive annexations in Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and they were going to sort of enslave populations. So there was nothing pretty about EU-ish about German victory.
How big a factor was Roosevelt?
Well, I mean, Roosevelt was, I think he was a powerful voice in urging intervention, but, he's in his twilight years. And when he tries to raise these brigades of volunteers, Wilson just says, no, you can't go, right? So I'm not sure really how big of a factor he is, but he's very representative of a current of opinion.
We'll take one or two more, we got to go. Yes, here. How big was the German-American factor in delaying our entry?
It was very big, and it was more in terms of just the power of their. And if you, what's the extraordinary thing about the? I got some about the United States. When I was researching in France recently, was that the number of foreign language newspapers in America in 1914, of Italian papers, of Yiddish papers, German papers, Polish papers, Ukrainian papers, but by far the biggest complement was German newspapers. There were like hundreds of German language newspapers in America. And so, I mean, you just didn't cross the Germans if you were interested in re-election. So that just by being, they were And the reason there were so many Germans is they'd come in the mid-19th century, whereas these other groups had come in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Germans had come in the mid-19th century, so they had reproduced in the meantime. They'd brought over like 8 million in the 1840s and 50s, and they were now 20 million by 1914. So the Germans were just this powerful voting bloc, and nobody wanted to trifle with them. The really interesting thing that I found about the Germans is that after the war, the U.S. takes up occupation duty briefly, and then they come home early in the Rhineland, and they start sympathizing immediately with the Germans, and they start saying like the French are dirty, the French are deceitful, the Germans are good people, they really got screwed in this war. And so I mean they write letters home to their congressmen and stuff like that. Why are we here? The Germans are the good guys, the French are the bad guys. So the whole situation was very muddled. And when you talk about sort of the post-war situation and then the recovery of Germany and the weakness of the Western powers, a lot of it has to do with this American attitude.
Let me just say before we take the last question that we're going to have a book signing for your book, Mad Catastrophe, out in the lobby. There will be other book signings. This is a chance to buy this extraordinary and extremely well-received book that you've just published. Here's a question. Would Germany have rearmed anyway without Hitler?
Well, I mean, yeah, they would have. Yeah, I mean, time would have passed, and they would have just the same way today they're rearming more than they ever have in the past, but not in the way that Hitler did. Hitler was, pledged to. I mean, the whole Nazi conception of Germany was that it was all had to do with race, and their whole conception of the world was had to do with race. So Hitler was adamant that these Germans, these huge German populations living in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Latvia, Estonia, that they were being polluted by living and marrying into these other races. And so they had to be redeemed. They had to be re-annexed and brought back into the German space. So this led to a war that might have been avoided by someone who just said, hey, look, we need to be able to have a proper army and maybe have minority rights for Germans in other areas, whereas Hitler had this sort of black and white conception of race that led directly to war.
As long as Hitler has come up, just quickly, what did he mean by the stab in the back? You said the war ended precipitously.
Well, because the November criminals, the Jewish the Jewish politicians in Berlin, they weren't all Jews, but there were a high percentage of them who were Jewish, who he claimed had argued for peace resolution and argued for exit from the war. And so they had stabbed the army, which was holding firm on the Hindenburg Line, in the back. And of course, this was nonsense. The army was being starved of food, shells. The home front was being totally starved. They were on their last legs. The only thing that was keeping them going was this inherent discipline of the Germans. I mean, every other army was collapsing, but not the Germans. But they would eventually have collapsed.
Jeff, for those who have more questions, he'll be at the book signing, of course, and also on Saturday at the panel. But let me take a sip of water while I ask you this question. And this is a humanities program, not just a history program. And so I'm going to ask you the zillion-dollar question, and I hope you'll just reflect on it for a minute, even though it's sort of a impossible and maybe insane question. But 8.5 million people are killed. You gave us some of the statistics. 60,000 killed in a single day. 300,000 in a month, 600,000 in a battle, whole armies annihilated, the whole army of Italy essentially dissolved and annihilated, to the point where France had been bled dry, to the point where those who remained were in mutiny. If you could pull back from this thing, it's not the Franco-Prussian War, it's unprecedented. If someone were looking in from Jupiter at this highly advanced European civilization with literature and music and the arts and an amazing achievement of thousands of years, saying, what happened here? Why would these countries go at each other's throats and kill off almost 9 million people and leave 57 million casualties? What, from an anthropological point of view, what does this even signify, do you think?
Well, I mean, before the war, there was a lot of discussion of this because, Jan Bloch, a Polish banker, wrote a book in like 1902 called The Future of War. And he looked at these emerging technologies, high explosive. Remember, the shells used in the Franco-Prussian War were black powder in a little cylinder, and they were dangerous, more dangerous than Napoleonic cannonballs, but they weren't that dangerous. But in the meantime, you'd invented TNT and lyddite and these chemical high explosives that could you could pack into much bigger shells, into rifled heavy artillery with longer range, more velocity, and they would burst and create these shards of metal that would that would spray across this big radius and kill far more people than a battalion of infantry. And then you add to that battalions of infantry armed with magazine rifles with clips of 8 rounds instead of muzzle-loading single-shot rifles or breech-loading single-shot rifles. Add to that machine guns firing 600 rounds a minute. Add to that defensive fortifications, trenches, sandbags, barbed wire. And Bloch, who had no military experience, he was a banker and an educated pundit, and he just said, war has become impossible. It becomes national suicide. And the interesting thing was the response of the European military is like, oh, what does he know? He's just a dumb civilian. And they all took refuge in the cult of the offensive. They said, look, in the Franco-Prussian War, the French had a primitive machine gun, the mitrailleuse, and they had the chassepot rifle, and the Prussians kept attacking and they won through. So we'll use the same approach here and we'll win. And they all had this cult of the offensive. And then as the war dragged on, they had to adopt new strategies to try to overcome defensive fire. And by the end, they did. In 1918, the Allies were going to win because they had figured out how to beat the Germans. And it was, I talked about the Battle of the Somme, 1916, 1.5 million shells. Chemin des Dames, 1917, 11 million shells. Passchendaele, 1917, 12 million shells. The Americans were preparing offensives for 1919 with like 30 million shells. They were just. And if you read a great novel, it's a Penguin Classics edition, not a novel, it's a memoir, by Ernst Jünger called Storm of Steel. It's one of the great World War I books, and reads like a novel. And it's Jünger's memoir of serving on the German side, and he talks about like what it was like to be a German under these British, French, American barrages. It's unbelievable. How they had to shelter through these storms of steel. So, and they were winning. The Germans just couldn't stand against this. But, so in other words, this had been predicted. The establishments had rejected the advice of, pundits saying that war is not going to work. But the interesting thing is that the armies did adapt in the course of the war. They did devise ways. The Germans initially, with their storm troop tactics in 1917, the way they destroyed the Russians, the way they destroyed the Italians, the way they nearly destroyed the British and French in the 1918 offensive. They had adapted, but more effective was the British and French response with this heavy, heavy use of artillery, taking full advantage of their industrial superiority. And they won. So, yeah, but that's why the war is such a trauma for everyone. That's why the Germans win so easily in 1939-40. Because Britain and France are just like, screw this, we're not going to do this again. They just can't conceive of doing this again, especially France. France bled so much more on a relative basis than the British did. They bled so badly, and then the Germans did because of their smaller population. You've got a population of 40 million in France, and you've got 70 million in Germany. So the French are like wiped out by the war, and they're just not going to do it again. So when the Germans get through the Maginot Line in 1940, it's like, okay, we're done.
Yes or no question. Sharon, are you coming up to make an announcement? So come on up. Yes or no question, Dr. Wawro. Can this happen again? We now think that war of that scale is absolutely unimaginable and unthinkable, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons. Can this happen again? So yes or no? Can it happen again?
Yes, because
yes.
Human nature is never changes.
What a depressing note. Thank you so much,
Well,
Geoffrey Wawro.